They found his truck first. Dust-coated, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition. The kind of scene that makes search and rescue teams go quiet. It had been sitting there, untouched, for 9 years. In 2011, a contract miner named Daniel Kovac drove into the northern Nevada backcountry to scout an old claim near the EERIE Desert. He told his brother he'd be back in 3 days. He never came back. The search lasted 2 weeks. They found tire tracks, boot prints leading toward a canyon, and then nothing. The case went cold. The family grieved. The desert kept its secrets. But in the spring of 2020, a pair of Bureau of Land Management rangers were surveying abandoned mine shafts when they stumbled onto something that didn't belong. A camp. Not old, not new. Somewhere in between. And inside a collapsed adit, a horizontal mining tunnel carved into the hillside, they found evidence that Daniel Kovac hadn't just disappeared. He'd been living there for years. What they uncovered in that tunnel wasn't just the remnants of survival. It was a timeline, a journal, a map, and a series of photographs that suggested Daniel hadn't been alone, that someone or something had been watching him, waiting. This is the story of a man who vanished into the Nevada wilderness and the inexplicable traces he left behind. A story that asks a question no one wants to answer. If he survived for years in that desert, why didn't he come home? And if he didn't survive, what was still moving around in that mine? If this type of story pulls you in, hit that like button and subscribe. We dive deep into the eerie and unexplained every week. Drop a comment if you've ever heard strange things about Nevada's abandoned mines. Now, let's rewind to where it all began. Daniel Kovac wasn't reckless. That's the first thing anyone who knew him would tell you. He was methodical, experienced, cautious in the way only someone who'd spent decades underground could be. Born in Elko, Nevada in 1967, Daniel grew up in a town where mining wasn't just work, it was identity. His father had been a hard rock miner, so had his grandfather. By the time Daniel turned 18, he was already working contract gigs, exploring old claims, assessing tunnel stability for small operations that couldn't afford full-time engineers. He wasn't rich, but he was respected. And in the tight-knit world of Nevada mining culture, that mattered more. In early May of 2011, Daniel received a tip from an old colleague about a forgotten claim near the EERIE Desert, just south of the Idaho border. The area was remote, even by Nevada standards, high desert plateau country, scarred with canyons and riddled with abandoned 19th century mines. The claim had been filed in 1883, worked briefly, then abandoned when the vein ran thin. But the tipster believed there was a secondary shaft that had never been fully explored. If Daniel could locate it, map it, and confirm ore presence, there might be money in a buyout from a larger operation. Daniel told his younger brother, Marcus, that he'd be gone 3, maybe 4 days. He'd camp near the site, do his surveys, take his samples, and drive back to Elko by the weekend. He packed his truck with the usual gear, water, canned food, a satellite phone, climbing rope, headlamps, notebooks. He brought his .357 revolver, not for people, but for rattlesnakes and the occasional aggressive coyote. He also brought his Canon camera. Daniel loved photography. He documented every site he explored, cataloging tunnel conditions, ore composition, even the light filtering through collapsed timbers. On May 9th, 2011, Daniel Kovac drove north on Route 225, turned onto a fire road, and disappeared. When he didn't return by May 13th, Marcus called the Elko County Sheriff's Office. A search was launched the next day. They found his truck within hours, parked at the end of a washed-out Jeep trail, about 4 miles from the old claim. The doors were unlocked. His sat phone was on the passenger seat, powered off. His wallet, ID, and keys were inside. His camping gear was gone. Boot prints led east, toward a narrow canyon. The tracks were clear for about half a mile, then vanished where the ground turned to hardpan and rock. Searchers combed the area for 2 weeks. They checked every visible mine entrance, every crevice, every ridge. Helicopters swept the terrain. Bloodhounds lost his scent at a dry creek bed. On May 28th, the search was suspended. Daniel Kovacs was declared missing, presumed dead. The assumption was exposure, dehydration, or a fall into an unmapped shaft. His family never accepted it, but they had no choice. The desert doesn't give up its dead easily. For 9 years, the case file gathered dust. Daniel's name became a footnote in Nevada's long list of missing prospectors, men swallowed by the same earth they'd spent their lives trying to read. The truck was eventually towed. The claim was never revisited. Life moved on. But in the spring of 2020, 2 things happened. First, the Bureau of Land Management began a systematic survey of abandoned mines in the EERIE region, part of a federal initiative to catalog hazards and prevent accidental deaths. Second, a pair of rangers named Elliot Marsh and Rachel Ortiz were assigned to a particularly isolated section of the plateau, less than 6 miles from where Daniel's truck had been found. They were looking for unstable shafts. What they found was something else entirely. Elliot Marsh had been a BLM ranger for 11 years. He'd seen a lot of strange things in the backcountry: illegal grows, squatter camps, makeshift shrines left by conspiracy theorists, convinced the desert held UFO evidence. But when he and Rachel Ortiz crested the ridge above the canyon on April 14th, 2020, he knew immediately that what he was looking at didn't fit any familiar category. The camp was situated on a shallow bench of rock, sheltered by an overhang and partially hidden by scrub juniper. At first glance, it looked abandoned. Closer inspection revealed something unsettling. It wasn't old, but it wasn't new either. The tarp stretched between 2 boulders was sun-bleached and shredded, but still partially intact. A rusted cookpot sat near a fire ring, the stones blackened but not weathered smooth. And beside the fire ring was a pair of boots, leather, cracked, but not disintegrated. "Someone was living here," Rachel said quietly. Elliot nodded. His first thought was that they'd stumbled on a hermit site, but something felt wrong. The placement was too intentional. The camp faced the canyon with clear sight lines in 3 directions. Defensive. Paranoid. They searched the immediate area. Beneath the tarp, they found a sleeping bag, molded and stiff with age, a dented canteen, a notebook, its pages warped and illegible from moisture, and then, half buried in wind-blown sand, a driver's license. Rachel picked it up, wiped it clean, and froze. The name on the license was Daniel Kovacs. Elliot felt his stomach tighten. He'd heard the name before. Every ranger in the region had. The miner who'd vanished in 2011. The cold case that had never been solved. And now, 9 years later, here was his ID, lying in a camp that looked like it had been used far more recently than 2011. "Check the notebook," Rachel said. Elliot pried it open carefully. The pages were stiff, many of them stuck together, but he could make out fragments of handwriting, dates, notes about water sources, sketches of the canyon, and on one page, barely legible, a single sentence. "It comes at night. Stay in the light." Rachel looked at Elliot. "What the hell does that mean?" Before he could answer, Rachel pointed toward the canyon wall. About 50 yards downslope, partially obscured by brush, was the entrance to a mine adit. The timbers framing the entrance were old, 19th century construction, but the ground in front of the opening was disturbed. Fresh. Someone had been going in and out. Elliot radioed their supervisor, requested backup, and documented the scene with his camera. Then, against his better judgment, he and Rachel approached the mine entrance. The adit sloped downward at a shallow angle, wide enough to walk upright. The air was cool and smelled faintly of minerals and decay. Elliot switched on his flashlight and stepped inside. The tunnel extended about 30 feet before opening into a small chamber, a workspace carved out by hand over a century ago. But it wasn't empty. Along the left wall, someone had stacked supplies, canned food, most of it expired, plastic water jugs, some full, some empty, a lantern, a folding knife, and leaning against the back wall, a camera. Rachel picked it up. It was a Canon, the same model Daniel had been carrying when he disappeared. The battery was dead, but the memory card was still inside. "We need to get this analyzed," she said. But Elliot wasn't listening. He was staring at the far corner of the chamber, where the rock face was covered in something that made his skin crawl. Scratches, hundreds of them, vertical lines, etched into the stone with a sharp object, grouped in sets of 5. Tally marks. Rachel counted them silently. Then she looked at Elliot, her face pale. "There are over 3,000 marks on this wall." Elliot did the math in his head. If each mark represented a day, that was more than 8 years. 8 years of someone, presumably Daniel Kovacs, living in this mine, counting the days, and for some reason, never leaving. "Why didn't he go home?" Rachel whispered. Elliot didn't answer, because he didn't have one. The Elko County Sheriff's Office reopened the Daniel Kovacs case within 24 hours of the discovery. The camera's memory card was sent to a forensic lab in Reno. The camp was secured and processed as a potential crime scene, though no one could say what crime had been committed. The notebook was sent to a documents examiner, who painstakingly separated the pages and photographed every legible fragment. Marcus Kovacs, Daniel's brother, was contacted on April 16th. He drove to the site the next day, accompanied by a detective named Laura Foss. Marcus hadn't been to the area since 2011. Walking into that camp, seeing his brother's driver's license, his boots, his camera, it shattered him. "He was alive," Marcus said, his voice hollow. "For years, he was alive, and he didn't call. He didn't come back. Why?" Detective Foss had no answer. The satellite phone had been in the truck. There was no evidence Daniel had ever tried to use it after he disappeared, and the camp, while clearly long-term, showed no signs of injury or restraint. Daniel hadn't been trapped. He'd chosen to stay. The forensic results arrived on April 22nd. The camera contained 1,247 photographs. Most were mundane, images of the mine interior, ore samples, rock formations, but scattered throughout were pictures that didn't make sense. Photographs of the canyon at night, taken from the camp. In several images, there appeared to be movement in the distance, blurred shapes near the ridgeline, too indistinct to identify. In one photo, taken at what the metadata indicated was 3:47 a.m., something was standing at the edge of the firelight. Humanoid. Tall. Motionless. The image was grainy, shot in low light, but the figure's proportions were wrong. Too thin, arms too long. The photo had been taken in July of 2015, more than 4 years after Daniel disappeared. The notebook provided more context, but only deepened the mystery. The fragments that could be read painted a picture of a man descending into paranoia. Early entries were practical. Notes on water, food rationing, plans to signal passing aircraft. But as the months wore on, the tone shifted. September 2011. Heard something walking past the camp last night. Didn't see it. Stayed in the tent until morning. November 2011. It's watching. I know it's watching. Stays just outside the firelight. If I move toward it, it retreats. If I stay still, it comes closer. March 2012. Can't risk leaving. It follows. Tested it twice. Both times I made it less than a mile before I heard it behind me. Turned back. It didn't follow me into the mine. August 2013. Lost count of days. Doesn't matter. The mine is safe. It won't come inside. I don't know why. The entries became sparser after 2014, but the tally marks on the wall continued. Detective Foss interviewed Marcus extensively, trying to understand Daniel's mental state before he disappeared. Marcus insisted his brother had no history of mental illness, no paranoia, no delusions. He'd been excited about the claim. optimistic, normal. So what happened to him out there? Foss asked. Marcus didn't know, but he wanted answers. The investigation expanded. A team of forensic anthropologists was brought in to search the area for remains. Cadaver dogs were deployed. They found nothing, no body, no bones, no evidence Daniel Kovac had died in that canyon. On April 30th, a decision was made. A team would enter the mine, map its full extent, and search for any additional evidence. Elliot Marsh and Rachel Ortiz volunteered to guide them. The mine, they knew, went deeper than the initial chamber. There was a secondary tunnel, partially collapsed, that led farther into the hillside. The question was, what was down there, and had Daniel Kovac gone looking for it? The mine was more extensive than anyone had anticipated. The initial chamber, where Daniel's supplies had been found, was only the beginning. Beyond the collapsed section, the tunnel split into two branches. The left branch dead-ended after 20 feet, choked with rubble. The right branch descended sharply, opening into a series of natural caverns that the original miners had intersected but never fully explored. The team moved carefully, their lights cutting through the darkness. The air was stale but breathable. The walls glistened with mineral deposits, and the floor was uneven, treacherous. About 60 feet down the right branch, they found another cache of supplies. More canned food, empty water jugs, and something new. A sleeping bag, laid out on a flat section of stone, as if someone had been sleeping there recently. He moved deeper, Elliot said. He wasn't just hiding in the main chamber. He went farther in. Rachel knelt beside the sleeping bag. It was damp, covered in a thin layer of dust, but not decomposed. She lifted it carefully and froze. Beneath it, scratched into the stone, was another message. It can't follow me here. Too deep. But I can hear it above. The team exchanged uneasy glances. Detective Foss, who had joined the expedition, took photographs and made notes. What was he running from? No one answered, because there was no logical answer. They continued deeper. The tunnel narrowed, forcing them to move single file. The temperature dropped. And then, about 100 feet from the entrance, they found the photographs. They were pinned to the wall with small stones, arranged in a grid, dozens of them, all printed on photo paper, faded and curling at the edges. Each image showed the same thing, the canyon at night, taken from different vantage points, and in every single photograph, there was a figure, sometimes distant, sometimes close, always watching. In one image, the figure was standing directly outside the mine entrance. Detective Foss examined the photos closely. These were taken over years. He was documenting it, whatever it was. Or he was losing his mind, one of the forensic techs said quietly. But Elliot wasn't convinced. He'd spent enough time in the wilderness to know that isolation could break a person. But Daniel's documentation was too methodical, too consistent. If he'd been delusional, the photos would have been erratic, chaotic. These were deliberate, obsessive. The tunnel opened into a final chamber, larger than the others. And there, in the center of the room, they found what they'd been looking for. A body. It was slumped against the far wall, partially mummified by the dry air. The clothing was tattered but recognizable. Jeans, a flannel shirt, work boots. Beside the body was a revolver, empty. And clutched in the skeletal hand was a notebook, different from the one found at the camp. Detective Foss approached carefully, her flashlight steady. She opened the notebook and read the final entry aloud. June 2019. I can't do this anymore. It's still out there. I've been here 8 years. I thought if I stayed long enough it would leave. But it never leaves. It just waits. I'm tired. I'm so tired. If anyone finds this, don't go looking for it. It doesn't want to be found. It just wants to watch. The final page was blank except for a single sentence, written in shaky handwriting. I'm sorry, Marcus. The body was identified through dental records as Daniel Kovacs. The coroner determined the cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound, estimated to have occurred in mid-2019. He'd survived in that mine for 8 years, documenting his isolation, his fear, and whatever he believed was stalking him. But the investigation didn't end there, because 3 days after the body was recovered, a hiker reported seeing something near the canyon. A tall figure, moving along the ridgeline at dusk. The hiker took a photo. When enhanced, the image showed the same proportions as the figures in Daniel's photographs. The area was closed to the public. The case was marked as resolved, but unofficially, questions remained. What had Daniel Kovacs seen? And was it still out there? In the months following the discovery, the investigation took an unexpected turn. Detective Foss, unable to let the case rest, began digging into the history of the EERIE region. What she found was a pattern. Daniel Kovacs wasn't the first person to disappear near that canyon. Between 1952 and 2011, 7 other individuals had vanished in the area under similar circumstances. Most were prospectors or hikers. All had been experienced outdoorsmen. None had been found. Search efforts had been thorough, but the desert had offered no answers. Foss obtained the old case files and cross-referenced them with Daniel's documentation. In 3 of the cases, witnesses had reported seeing someone near the last known location of the missing person, a figure described as unusually tall, moving in an unnatural way. In one instance, a search and rescue volunteer had photographed what he believed was a person on a distant ridge. When the photo was enlarged, the figure's proportions didn't match any human profile. The reports had been dismissed as misidentifications, tricks of light, or heat mirages. But now, in the context of Daniel's evidence, they took on new significance. Foss also discovered something else. The mine where Daniel had taken refuge had a history. In 1889, 2 miners working the claim had been found dead inside the tunnel. The official report stated they'd succumbed to bad air, carbon monoxide, or methane buildup. But a handwritten note in the margin of the report, penned by the local sheriff, offered a different account. The miners had barricaded themselves inside the adit, using timbers and stones to block the entrance. They died of dehydration, not gas. The sheriff speculated they'd been hiding from something, but the note ended abruptly, as if he'd decided not to pursue the thought. Foss presented her findings to her superiors. The response was muted. There was no evidence of foul play. Daniel's death had been ruled a suicide. The case was closed. But Foss couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missed. She returned to the site one final time in late October of 2020, accompanied by a wildlife biologist named Dr. Alan Trudeau. Trudeau specialized in large predator behavior, mountain lions, bears, wolves. Foss wanted his opinion on whether an animal could account for Daniel's fear. They hiked into the canyon at dawn. Trudeau examined the photographs, the camp, the mine. His conclusion was unequivocal. No known animal behaves this way, he said. Predators don't stalk without attacking. They don't observe for years. And they don't follow people for miles without engaging. Whatever Daniel believed he saw, it wasn't a mountain lion or a bear. Then what was it? Foss asked. Trudeau hesitated. I don't know, but if he was documenting something real, then it's something we haven't identified yet. As they prepared to leave, Foss noticed something. Fresh tracks in the sand near the camp. Humanoid. Barefoot. The stride length was over 4 feet, far longer than any human could manage comfortably. The tracks led toward the ridgeline and then vanished. Trudeau photographed them, measured them, and said nothing. When Foss asked for his assessment, he shook his head. I'll include them in my report, but I'm not making any guesses. They left the canyon that afternoon. The case was officially closed 2 weeks later. Daniel Kovacs' body was returned to his family and cremated. Marcus held a small memorial service in Elko. Fewer than 20 people attended. But for Foss, the story didn't end there. She kept copies of the photographs, the notebooks, the forensic reports. She reviewed them periodically, searching for an explanation she knew she'd never find. In March of 2021, the BLM completed its survey of the EERIE abandoned mines and issued a final report. The adit, where Daniel had taken refuge, was permanently sealed with concrete and steel grating, deemed too unstable for public access. The camp was dismantled. The canyon returned to silence, and the figure in the photographs was never explained. There are places in the world that refuse easy answers. The northern Nevada desert is one of them. It's a landscape of extremes, brutal heat, freezing nights, distances that swallow sound and light. People go there seeking something: gold, solitude, clarity, and sometimes they don't come back. The official explanations are familiar: dehydration, exposure, falls into hidden shafts. But every so often, a case emerges that doesn't fit the pattern. Daniel Kovach's story is one of those cases. We know the facts. We know he survived for 8 years in a mine, documenting something he believed was watching him. We know he eventually took his own life, unable to endure the isolation and fear any longer. We know that other people across decades reported seeing something similar in the same area. And we know that no definitive explanation has ever been provided. What we don't know is what Daniel actually saw. Was it a psychological break triggered by isolation and the harsh environment? Was it a misidentification of wildlife, distorted by fear and exhaustion? Or was it something else? Something the desert has kept hidden for generations. Detective Foss, in her final report, wrote, "Daniel Kovach was a rational, experienced man who spent the last years of his life in terror. Whether that terror was justified is a question I cannot answer. What I can say is that the evidence suggests he believed it was real, and belief, in the end, was enough to trap him." Marcus Kovach still lives in Elko. He doesn't talk about his brother much anymore, but in a brief interview in 2021, he said something that haunts anyone familiar with the case. Danny knew that desert better than anyone. If he chose to stay in that mine, it's because he thought leaving was worse. And I don't know what that means, but it scares me. The canyon remains open to the public, though few people visit. The mine is sealed. The camp is gone. But the land remembers. And sometimes, late at night, hikers report seeing something on the ridgeline. A figure, tall and still, watching. No one has ever gotten close enough to confirm what it is. And maybe that's for the best. Because if Daniel Kovach spent 8 years hiding from it, perhaps the wisest thing we can do is leave it alone. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Some questions aren't meant to have answers. And some places in the desert are better left unexplored. The story of Daniel Kovach ends in a sealed mine surrounded by silence. But the question he left behind, what was out there, watching him, remains open. And in the vastness of the Nevada backcountry, where the stars burn cold and the wind carries no voices, that question lingers still, waiting.